Hello everyone and welcome back to the IS Network lecture series on discussing UPSC case studies. So till now in the previous lectures we have covered case studies, one case study from each year till year 2017. So in this lecture we'll be taking a new case study from year 2018, which is basically based on a current topic, that is whistleblowing or the right to privacy of the individual. So it's a contemporary issue on which the case study was asked. So let's discuss the case study. So I'll go through the case study with you, the question itself, and then we'll discuss what can be the approach to solve this case study. So Edwin Snowden, a computer expert and a former CIA systems administrator, releases confidential information documents to the press about the existence of the government surveillance programs. So basically, he's whistleblowing and he's releasing some confidential information into the public domain. According to many legal experts and the US government, his actions violated the Espionage Act of 1917, which identified the leaks of state secrets as an act of treason. So basically, the law that dictates such a behavior is the Espionage Act of 1917, and basically it marks that someone who leaks such kind of state secrets is basically doing an act of treason. So he's going against the state or the national interest. Yet, despite the fact that he broke the law, Snowden argues that he had a moral obligation to act. He gave a justification for his whistleblowing by stating that he had a duty to inform the public as to what is done in their name and that what which is done against them. So basically he says that the law and the ethics were having two different directions in this. The law dictates that he should put the national interest as paramount and should not divulge any such kind of information, whereas his morals are telling him that he should go forward with the whistleblowing because the state is there to govern the people and it's basically comes into existence for the welfare of the people, and thus people being the sovereign have the right to know that what the state is doing in their name and how state is even infringing upon the rights of the people. So according to Snowden, the government's violation of privacy has to be exposed regardless of the legalities, since more substantive issues of social action and public morality were involved here. So basically he's putting the ethics over and above the law at place. Many agreed with Snowden. Few argued that he broke the law and compromised the national security, for which he should be held accountable. So basically, there were views and counter views regarding the action taken by Edward Snowden. Do you agree that Snowden's action were ethically justified, even if legally prohibited? Why and why not? Make an argument by weighing the competing values in the case. So basically, the case is asking you your opinion that is it ethically justified to do such a kind of thing, and if yes, why, and if not, why. And basically you have to take the help of the competing values and how are you going to resolve the conundrum. So this is the whole case. So you have to put in the values that are being at conflict as well as justify the action taken by Edward Snowden. So now let's try and approach this case study. So basically now we have to look into the fact that every question, as we have discussed earlier as well, needs to have a introduction, a body and a conclusion. So we need to look into all these three domains in the question. So as we have discussed that every question has a introduction, a body and a conclusion. So for the introduction, as we have seen in the question itself, there is a clear-cut indication that there is a law versus ethics debate in the question. So you can very easily start with something related to this ever existing debate, that is laws versus ethics. So you can very easily take something from your constant portion also, that these two are generally in consonance. And the reason for that is basically laws also have a moral standing, because laws basically get their authority from social contract. Thus, most of the times laws and ethics are generally in consonance. However, they are in conflict at certain times, generally because laws have limited scope, and laws basically cannot put into concrete terms the intention behind the action. So basically, in generally in these two situations, you have laws going against the ethics. For example, limited scope of a law could be that it can guide you in terms of not committing some kind of action. However, your intention could still be, so it's almost like the difference between honesty and integrity, where honesty is basically doing something wrong and basically accepting that you have done something wrong, whereas integrity is not doing the wrong itself, you being able to evaluate the action and basically not taking the negative steps. So laws have a limited scope, they can tell you what is the don'ts and what is the do's of something, whereas ethics define the underlying thought process, underlying logic behind carrying out that action. So this could be your introduction, where you basically bring out the difference between law and ethics, and basically when these two things are in conflict, you face a ethical dilemma kind of a situation. Similarly, if you can remember, when in the non-cooperation movement, after the non-cooperation movement, when Gandhiji was being imprisoned, he had very beautifully differentiated between ethics and law. So basically, he said that if you believe that what I did was something against the law, I am ready to accept the punishment for it. However, for you it might be breaking the law, but for me it was the highest duty of a citizen. So basically, he differentiates that something which is ethical might not be legal, and something which is legal might not be ethical all the time. So basically, he drew the conundrum between the two terms, and depending on the situation. So this could easily be your conclusion as well, or you can use it in introduction. Now we have to look at the values at conflict, which was asked in the question. So the values at conflict in this scenario is basically truth to the public versus loyalty to the government or CIA. Similarly, you have truth versus credibility of the government, because if he says something against, if he basically comes out in the open and tells that the government is using the data of the people in order to snoop or basically have surveillance over the people, it might lead to decrease in the credibility of the government. Similarly, empathy and compassion towards the citizen versus basically their right to privacy. Sorry, so empathy and compassion basically exemplified in terms of their right to privacy, because people have the right to privacy versus you can have the national security. Similarly, you can have that personal conscience. His personal conscience is basically dictating him to divulge the information, whereas his professional commitment is going against it, which says that you have to follow the rules and regulations of the organization. Similarly, you can say that justice for the citizens versus the international image of the country, because if he divulges that kind of information, it would bring down the credentials of the government being a liberal democracy, and basically it would lower down the authority of the state and its standing in the international domain. So basically these are the values at conflict. So now comes the argument. Now you have this could be your introduction and the linking paragraph, or the one component of the answer that has been asked. The second component that has been asked is evaluation of the ethicality of the action. So basically two things are being two things are there in the case. One is being argued that the act was ethical or not. Similarly, another thing is, was the act legal or not? So two things are there in this. So let's try and deal with the legal component. So was the act which was done by Edward Snowden, or the whistleblowing, was it legal to do? So if basically he had, so one argument that could be put forward in this is basically he was well within his rights. Reason being that he had quit the organization. Prior to divulging such information. Similarly, he had done it with his name or openly. So he had not done it anonymously. So his intentions are itself quite alright. However, if you have to argue that if you have to argue the ethicality of this action, we will have to evaluate both the options. That is, if no whistleblowing, how can you argue for no whistleblowing? For no whistleblowing, we can say that it would have been in consonance with the act, Espionage Act. We can argue it on the basis of loyalty to the organization. We can argue it through the dimension of professional ethics or professional commitment. We can argue it through the dimension of your national interest, national security, international image. So all these arguments could be put forward for basically not divulging any such kind of information. Similarly, for the opposite case, which is basically divulging the information, we can argue the following things. So one argument that I raised forward was it is external whistleblowing. So it's not that he was part of the organization and then he did not basically go through the internal complaint mechanism and directly went to the external mechanism. So basically he had not been the part of the organization, and being an external actor, he was well within his rights to basically divulge any such kind of information. He was not bounded by the contract of being an employee of the company or the employee of the organization. Similarly, we can argue it from the Gandhian perspective that an unjust law is itself a species of violence. Or the statement I told you in the introduction, we can use that also. That he argues that what you considered as being illegal is considered by me as the highest duty of a citizen. Similarly, we can argue it also on the basis of Rousseau's social contract theory that I discussed in the very first introduction, that the law has a moral foundation in terms of the social contract theory. However, the social contract itself gets broken down when the state exceeds its power. So basically, when the state is doing something which is it is not entitled to do, it is basically breaking the social contract itself, thus eroding the moral foundation of the law. Thus, it validates the action taken by Edward Snowden. So we can even say that the sovereignty lies with the people. So basically, if the government is taking an action against the people itself, so it violates the social contract theory. Now Socrates would also argue that one must speak the truth because he values truth as a supreme virtue. Similarly, if we have to argue this, we can even argue from Kant's categorical imperative. That the means are equally important as the ends, or the means are even more important than the ends. So national security is important. However, how you attain that is also equally important. And if you have to see it from the civil services point of domain, we can very easily argue that transparency and accountability are the foundational values. So we can argue that the action is guided by the foundational values of the civil services. However, we can even argue this from the utilitarian perspective. That in the short term, yes, the national interest might be served. However, if we see it in the long term, it might lead to a slippery slope where the state basically infringes upon the right of the people. So if the government basically corrects their surveillance system or basically comes out clean in this kind of a case, it would even boost their image and it would boost their morale of the people. It would increase their confidence in the government. So basically, if such kind of activities snooping around is done by the government, it would essentially degrade its credibility in the long term, because sooner or later these kind of things would surface upon in the public domain, and that would be more detrimental to the government. So basically, these could be the arguments in the favor of divulging the information. So if one must argue that the step taken by Edward Snowden was correct because of the following reasons. We have argued it through the external whistleblowing. So this is basically a legal component of it. Similarly, we have tried to argue it from the Gandhian's perspective, the social contract theory perspective, similarly Kantian as well as utilitarian perspective. So we have tried to argue the same action through multiple theories. So this is basically the analysis part of the question. Now comes the conclusion. So in the conclusion, you have to basically pinpoint the social contract theory and the value of trust. So you have to emphasize that government cannot lose the trust of the people, and so between the government and the citizens, the bond is of trust. So this bond is as strong as the trust in the government. So even if surveillance is required for national security, and yes, a lot of governments are actually doing it as well, so surveillance should be through a legal mechanism. There should be a proper law which must be debated in the public domain, and the people must be informed. There should be informed consent. So the people must be informed that yes, few agencies have such power of surveillance and it would be utilized in particular scenarios and the powers of the agencies are capped in certain sense. There should be some accountability, some transparency mechanism. So it should be under the oversight of the parliament. For example, there should be a regulatory mechanism for it. No one apart from certain level of officers should be able to give the permission for such kind of surveillance. So these kind of transparent mechanism should be developed even if the state agencies are required to undertake surveillance for national security. Similarly, so this could be your logic and the concluding logic, whereas you can put in a quote as well in the ending which says basically, which sums up your thought process. And you can very easily quote the Vibhishan in Ramayana versus Karna in Mahabharata. So these two characters had taken the completely opposite direction. Whereas Vibhishan had taken the path of truth, Krishna had taken the path of friendship and siding with the evil. So you can very easily see the difference that their final destination took them to. So basically, you can pinpoint that one who seek truth ended up leading a very good life, whereas Karan met his fate because of him choosing being loyal to the friend rather than actually standing by the path of truthfulness and honesty. So you can conclude with these kind of examples as well. So so let's recap what we have discussed in this case. The case was essentially between the two dimensions, that is laws versus ethics. So we have introduced the case with some understanding of when does laws and ethics remain in consonance, whereas when they are in conflict. So we had given some theoretical understanding of the cases. Then we had discussed various values and conflict, being it truth versus loyalty, truth versus credibility of the government, empathy and right to privacy versus national security, and so on. Then we had tried to argue both the stands, whether to the whistleblowing, external whistleblowing, or not whistleblowing at all. So we had discussed the benefits as well as ethical components of both these arguments, and we had to try to argue it from multiple dimensions, multiple theories. Then we had concluded based on the how the surveillance, if at all needed, should be done, and given the doctrine of trust as the conclusion. So this completes our discussion for this case study of 2018. So if you need any help in your answer evaluation, etc., you can refer to the IS Network website for its paid subscriptions. Thank you.